Hello and welcome to this short video about electric vehicle charging infrastructure. My name is Konrad. I work as the head of research at Solactive, and I want to give you a short introduction into the electric vehicle infrastructure theme. Now, we can't talk about the infrastructure without talking about the electric vehicles. And I'm going to start with a bold statement here that I've taken from the Bloomberg Evo Report 2022, one of the leading publications around the future of electric vehicles and the industry. And it says that by 2040, 60% of all vehicles on the roads will be electric. Now, what are the drivers behind that? I think one of the major drivers behind that is that a lot of jurisdictions are going to stop selling fossil fuel-based cars. The EU has just confirmed its sales stop for fossil fuel cars by 2035, and the US are working with quotas for electric vehicles to be registered. But generally speaking, by 2040, we're going to see fossil fuel-based car sales mostly outlawed in most jurisdictions. Secondly, car makers are reacting to this, and we're going to see a massive expansion of the available electric vehicles, going from what is today mostly a luxury vehicle segment into all segments, going from small cars all the way up to pickup trucks that are going to be available electric. And some of the car makers, and I've picked out Volvo here, have already announced plans to completely stop building fossil fuel-based cars. So Volvo will be fully electric by 2030, and I fully expect other car makers to follow suit. And lastly, the automotive ecosystem is adapting fast as well. So last week, Uber announced that it will be making its fleet electric in the sense of that it will only allow drivers of electric vehicles on its platform. Car rental companies like Sixt have announced they want to go 70 to 90% of their fleet electric. Hertz has just been in the news around buying 100,000 Tesla Model 3s and another 175,000 electric vehicles from General Motors to expand or to rapidly expand the electrification of their fleets. All of this is going to drive the fact that we will see a majority of electric vehicles on the roads by 2040 if things continue as they are right now. Now, where will those cars charge? Currently about 4% of the vehicles on the road are electric, so charging infrastructure hasn't really been that much in focus. And that has another reason, because electric vehicles right now are mostly luxury vehicles. The Teslas, the Porsches, all of those cars tend to come at a premium, and the early adopters that buy them tend to be affluent and have the ability to actually charge the vehicle either at home or at their workplace or both. Which kind of makes charging infrastructure something that is less of a concern for day-to-day use of those vehicles. But if we think about expanding the use of electric vehicles beyond that early adopter affluent range to the majority of the population, where most people don't necessarily have charging infrastructure at home or even the ability to park at home. So in Germany, just about 50% of people have their own parking spot and everybody else parks on the street. In countries like the Netherlands, it's even worse. There's 70% of people who don't have the ability to park or have a safe place where they can definitely charge their cars. So they will be needing public charging infrastructure. And this is actually now one of the major blockers for adoption of electric vehicles. A lot of people that I talk to, but also there are studies out there, people are hesitant to buy electric vehicles because they're worried about where am I going to charge it. And this is now becoming something that also catches the attention of policymakers because it threatens the achievement of the Paris Agreement goals, which relies heavily on the electrification of mobility. So lawmakers are beginning to think about this. And we've seen it in the US Infrastructure Act that the Biden administration has pulled through. There's $7.5 billion dedicated to the expansion of EV charging networks. And just recently, yesterday, we've seen news that those subsidies are going to be available in all 50 states plus Puerto Rico. So that's big news for the expansion of EV charging networks in the US. In Europe, I haven't seen dedicated numbers, but 30% of Europe's CO2 emissions do come from the mobility sector. And the Paris Agreement, the goal to reach the Paris Agreement, the net zero by 2050, relies heavily on the electrification. So there's an interim goal by 2030 that the EU wants to have 30 million electric vehicles on the EU's roads. So let's take a look at what does that mean for the infrastructure that we need. So at the moment, next bold statement, we have less than 10% of the required charging infrastructure available that we need in order to meet those interim EV goals in 2030. And what's that based on? So the EU has commissioned some research to figure out how much charging infrastructure are we going to need if we're going to put 30 million electric vehicles on the road by 2030. And the research has come back pretty much with a simple number, and it's good for us because it's easy to calculate, so that we need around one charging station for every 10 electric vehicles. Now, bear that ratio in mind, and we move on to those goals. So the US has said by 2030 they want 2.4 million electric vehicles on the roads, and the EU has said that they want 30 million electric vehicles on the road. Sorry, can we do that again? So the US have said that they want 24 million electric vehicles on the road by 2030, and the EU want 30 million electric vehicles on the road by 2030. So translating that back into charging station means 2.4 million charging stations in the US and 3.0 million charging stations in Europe. If you look at the current numbers, around 100,000 in the US, 250,000 in Europe, it tells us we've got a substantial amount of expansion that still is needed in the next 8 years, effectively, in order to make the electric mobility feasible. Now, let's talk a little bit about the type of chargers, right? So if you're parking your car overnight at home, you're okay with a slow charger because you'll have all night to recharge your car for the next day. Same thing is true if you're going to park your car at work for 8 hours. So the chargers that we're seeing in those places, 11 to 22 kilowatt hours, they're completely sufficient. However, if you're in a public space and you don't have that private access to parking, you're going to want to charge your car quickly, just like the experience at a petrol station. And then 11 22 kilowatts aren't going to be enough because you're going to have to stay there for 4 or 5 hours in order to get your battery filled up. So you really only want to be there for 10 or 20 minutes. So you're going to need much higher charging speeds, 50, 150. There's some chargers out there now that can do over 300 kilowatt hours, which really realistically turns it into, you're going to stop your car, you're going to grab a coffee, you're going to come back, and you have 80% of your battery left. And we're going to see that, and we're going to see technology advance. The newer models of cars that are going to come out are going to be able to sustain higher charging speeds, and the charging networks will also be able to do that as the technology advances. However, if we look back at that already installed base of charging stations, most of those are actually 11 to 22 kilowatt hour chargers, which won't help us with the expansion. So actually, there's even more need for charging infrastructure, and as the charging infrastructure is being built, it will also have to be expanded to become faster to meet the demands, especially if we also then begin to go thinking beyond just the personal vehicles, but also think about trucks and buses that will also become increasingly electric, and they'll have bigger batteries and they'll want to charge faster as well. So what is the business behind the charging infrastructure? So interestingly, in Europe and the US, the expansion of the charging networks is largely left to the private sector. So there is private companies, or luckily in our case, listed companies that are building those networks and also building the hardware. So what we're currently seeing is those two business models. The first one is the operation of a charging network. So a company like ChargePoint or Fastnet in Europe, if you're familiar with those stations, they are building large-scale charging networks, and their goal is to make sure that you can find a charging station wherever you go and be able to charge quickly. Now, charging stations can be franchised. So somebody who owns a piece of land, maybe already has a gas station or a fast food restaurant, they can actually go and franchise those charging stations and put them up there. And the operator of the charging network will take care of all the logistics, of the design of the station, of the billing and the administration. And ultimately, those providers of those networks, they will actually make a revenue every time there's a charging session. So here's a lot of scalability in that as we get more electric vehicles, there'll be a lot more charging sessions, and these network providers will be able to profit from expanding their networks and also from the expansion of the electric vehicle fleets on the road. The other business model is very simply building the hardware. So every single one of those charging stations requires dedicated hardware to provide the actual charging process. And as we've just seen, there's a massive need for expanding of those stations in the first place. But even when they're all built, we're expecting that this sector is going to continue to grow for decades, just based on the fact that technological innovation will also lead to a certain exchange of the stations as the charging speeds get faster. So we basically built an index around this idea. In the Selective Electric Vehicle Charging Infrastructure Index, we currently have 13 companies that represent this sector as it's traded on the stock exchanges. And if we just look at the current composition for a second, the largest component at the moment is ChargePoint, which is the largest provider of charging stations or charging station networks in the United States. But we got a bunch of other companies here as well from all sorts of geographies, even though the United States does currently dominate the index portfolio, as it does many other large indices as well. In terms of performance, maybe it's kind of interesting to note that investors haven't entirely overlooked the idea that electric vehicles are going to be the dominant vehicles. If we look at the share price of Tesla, we see that Tesla is the most valuable car company in the world based on market capitalization, even though in terms of actual sales numbers, they lag far behind a lot of their competitors that they're substantially larger than. And that obviously is because people are seeing an electric future and they see Tesla well positioned to thrive in that. But what we haven't seen is a similar development in the EV charging infrastructure, and that's why we think this sector is particularly noteworthy, because there may be some growth opportunities here in the future. And when talking about opportunities, we do also have to talk about risks a little bit. So it's clear that this index is a very narrow index, and some of the advantages that indices typically have, like providing broad diversification across multiple different business models and sectors, is not as dominant here, because we are talking about a very narrow selection of stocks. It's only 13 stocks. They're all doing essentially the same thing. So you can expect slightly more volatility and market risks than in a typically broader diversified index portfolio. And we are talking about a new technology in sort of disruptive and uncertain times. So there is a risk of technological disruption. So if the electric vehicle does not turn out to be the answer to the net zero scenario and the Paris Agreement, then obviously this sector will also not be able to realize some of those growth opportunities. And that brings me to the end of my short talk about electric vehicle charging infrastructure. I hope you enjoyed this video. Find more information about us and our indices on selective.com. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.